There are many misconceptions about Post-Stalin USSR. We will analyze and debunk them all. In this series, we will discuss many topics, such as state of the whole people, peaceful coexistence, the post-Stalin USSR economy, the fall of the USSR, and many more topics. So if you are interested in post-Stalin USSR, be it as a leftist or just a curious person in general, just lay back and enjoy my video. Debunking Misconceptions about Post-Stalin USSR, Episode 6, Part 4, Leonid Brezhnev's Economic Reforms. Before I start this video, I want to say that this episode is technically divided into 4 parts. The first is about the evolution of the Soviet Rohozy in 1965 and the Lieberman-Kosygin reforms. The second part covers everything from 1966 to 1970, such as real socialism or gas, and in large part cyber planning, about how the Lieberman-Kosygin reforms were extended to different sectors of industry, the reform on loans and credit, and stagnation. Part 3 further talks about how there was no stagnation, about ASPR, which was basically all gas after 1970, and about the 1973 Kosygin reforms. Also, I want to quickly say that we will go in chronological order, or will at least try to go in chronological order as much as possible. So we will start with the agricultural reforms of 1977 and 1981, and we'll stop at the 1979 Kosygin reforms. Many, like Mao and Hoxha, say that Brezhnev's economic reforms destroyed central planning and established capitalism. Is this true? No, that's wrong, and we will debunk all arguments made by Mao, Descartes, Hoxha, and others against Brezhnev's economic reforms. Now I know that I first promised to talk about the 1977 and 1981 agricultural reforms, but I'd like to first talk about BUM. It, of course, was not an economic reform, but I still think that it's necessary to address. I think that it's unfair how everyone, even a lot of pro-post-Stalin USSR Russians, throw shit at Khrushchev for the corn campaign, yet completely forget about Stalin's ROC campaign, and especially forget about BUM, which was Brezhnev's version of the corn campaign, that being a gigantic failure and a waste of resources. Let's first talk about what BUM even was. So, what was BUM? To quote an article, the Baikor-Amur main line is a railway in eastern Siberia and the Far East. It's Russia's second main railway outlet to the Pacific Ocean. The total length of the highway is 4,300 kilometers. Over the entire history of its construction, more than 2 million people participated in it. Basically, the Baikal-Amur main line, also known as BUM, is a gigantic railway that spans for 4,300 kilometers. Let's talk more about its length and size. The main line of BUM is the Ust-Kut section on the Lena River, Komsomolsk on Amur, 3,110 kilometers. It is adjacent to 2 sections built in the late 1940s to early 1950s. Tayshet, Ust-Kut, and Komsomolsk on Amur, Sovetskaya Gavan. The road crosses 11 deep rivers and 7 mountain ranges. More than 1,000 kilometers of track are laid in areas of permafrost or high seismicity. On the highway, 8 tunnels have been breached, 142 bridges more than 100 meters long, more than 200 railway stations and sidings, more than 60 cities and towns have been built. In general, bridges, tunnels, viaducts, anti-avalanche walls, and other engineering structures make up a third of the length of BUM. I don't think that there is much to explain here. Let's move on to the history of BUM. Let's first talk about plans about BUM. The history of the concept of BUM technically dates back to the 1880s in the Russian Empire, but I'd like to talk about the history of it in the USSR more. Let's further read the article, and oh, by the way, you can see a map of BUM in the video right now. This is how it looks like, or was at least supposed to look like. In 1924, the Council of Labor and Defense of the USSR talked about the necessity to build a railway parallel to the Trans-Siberian Railway further from the border, in the interior of the country as a rock road in case of war with Japan, as well as for access to regional minerals. In 1930, the Central Committee of the CPSU and the Council of People's Commissars of the USSR proposed to design organizations in Siberia and the Far East to begin developing plans for the construction of a road with access to the Pacific Ocean. It was then that the road was first named the Baikal-Amur main line. In 1953, the first meters of rails were laid in the northern direction towards the village of Tendinsky at the bomb station, a small siding near the settlement of Skavarodino, built in 1932. In 1937, it was decided to build a highway from Taishet to Sovetska Gavan. The laying of the track on the meridional lines that were supposed to connect the BAM with the Trans-Siberian Railway began. I don't think that there is much to explain here, so let's just move on. In 1940, the movement of trains on the Izvestkovaya Orgal section was opened. In 1941, with the beginning of the Great Patriotic War, the already laid tracks were dismantled and used for the construction of a railway line along the Volga. From 1943 to 1945, the Komsomolsk on Amur-Sovetska Gavan railway was built. From 1950 to 1959, the Taishet-Lena Road Ustkut was built, which stimulated the intensive development of the area's natural resources, energy, forest, iron ore, etc. By the early 1960s, more than 1,150 of the 4,000 kilometers of the BAM highway had been put into operation. The second meridian connection of the BAM with the Trans-Siberian Railway, the Izvestkovaya-Orgal highway, has come into operation. I don't think that there is much to explain here. Alright, let's talk about the development of BAM under Brezhnev. In 1973, the port of Vostochny in Wrangel by Vanino began its work, which became the seagate of BAM. 1974 is considered to be the year of the second birth of BAM. The active construction of the highway began in many directions at once by the Komsomol construction troops and parts of the railway troops of the USSR. From 1972 to 1977, the BAM-Tinda road, which was dismantled in 1941, was restored. The third meridian connection of BAM with the Trans-Siberian Railway. In 1976, the development of coking coals in southern Yakutia began. The first high-speed shipping line to Lake Baikal was opened, which connected the Trans-Siberian Railway with the city of Severobaikalsk under construction on the BAM. In 1979, the construction of the eastern section of the BAM from Urgal to Komsomolsk on Amur was completed. From 1980 to 1981, the most important object of BAM was built, the bridge over the Vitim River, one of the most difficult on the highway. By the way, BAM started in 1974, to quote an article. In March 1974, Soviet General Secretary Brezhnev proposed that the BAM would be one of the two major projects in the 10th five-year plan, 1976 to 1980. He famously stated that the BAM will be constructed with clean hands only, and firmly rejected the suggestion to again use prison labor. A few weeks later, he challenged the Young Communist League Komsomol to join in the construction project of the century. 17th Komsomol Congress held in April 1974 announced BAM, a Komsomol shock construction project, created the central Komsomol headquarters of BAM construction, and appointed Dmitry Filipov the chief of the headquarters. Let's move on to the development of BAM after Brezhnev. By January 1st, 1983, more than 400 million cubic meters of earthworks had been completed on the construction of the BAM. 3,400 highways, 1,400 bridges, and 1,800 culverts were built. 2,260 kilometers of the main railway tracks were built. In January 1984, the first train formed in Tында arrived at the Yaroslavsky railway station in Moscow exactly on schedule. On October 27, 1984, the so-called Golden Link was built, connecting the road along the entire line from Taishet to Vanino. In 1988, permanent traffic commissioning began on the BAM. So why did BAM fail? Well, firstly, it was a gigantic waste of resources and a gigantic waste of money. This was a failure. This should have been finished by 1983. So it took 17 years to complete, if not more. Quote Wikipedia yet again. By the end of 1974, perhaps 50,000 young people of the 156,000 young people who applied had moved to the BAM service area. In 1975 and 1976, 28 new settlements were inaugurated, and 70 new bridges, including the Amur and Lena bridges, were erected. And while 110 miles, 180 kilometers of track was laid, the track laying rate would have needed to nearly triple to meet the 1983 deadline. The BAM was again declared complete in 1991. By then, the total cost to build the line was 14 billion US dollars, or in rubles, 106 trillion rubles. Over the entire history of the construction of the BAM, about 2 million people participated in it. Between 1978 and 1990, BAM transported 379 million tons of cargo, including 112.7 million tons of coal, 65.4 million tons of timber, and 33 million passengers. The construction of the highway cost the state, without taking into account lost profits, 17.7 billion rubles in estimated prices as of January 1st, 1991, and when taking into account lost profits, at an average annual rate of 8%, 55.3 billion rubles. But now the question arises, why were so many resources and money wasted on this? Couldn't the USSR have wasted far less resources and money yet have created a successful project? Well, BAM was planned very badly. To quote an article, beginning in the mid-1980s, the BAM project attracted increasing criticism for bad planning. Infrastructure and basic services like running water were often not in place when workers arrived. The building of the BAM has also been criticized for its complete lack of environmental production. BAM was planned very badly. Had the state planned it better, focused more on it, and planned better how to waste resources and money as little as possible, and in the most efficient ways, then it might have been successful. In a lot of ways, this wasn't planned at all. Young unprofessional people like university students signed up at this project voluntarily, of whom most didn't actually take part in. Instead of making unprofessional young people build the BAM, in my opinion, actual professional builders, or at least prisoners, should have constructed the BAM, and it should have been planned in size. I think that at least 3 million people should have built it instead of 2 million, and the amount of builders should have been planned by the state beforehand in like 1974 or so, and the project would have been far more successful then. Right now, what is known as BAM 2.0 is being constructed by the Russian state, and it works pretty well. The tradition of having failed national projects is a bad trait that every important Marxist leader of the USSR had. This trait goes all the way back to the Stalin era. This is a very bad trait, which was inherited by Stalin's successors, who were Stalin loyalists, Khrushchev and Brezhnev. Under Stalin there was the disastrous RLC campaign, which was objectively the worst national project done by a USSR leader, as this didn't just hurt the economy or anything, it also hurt a lot of lives. It made a lot of fish and fish species go extinct, as well as sea life in general in the Aral Sea, and destroyed the world's fourth largest lake. The This is a video about Brezhnev, so I won't talk much about it, but if you want to learn more about it, you can just watch a video about it that I'll put in the description of this video. Khrushchev had his disastrous corn campaign, which made the corn be planted in Siberia, which decreased agricultural output. I talked about it in episode 5 of my Post-Stalin USSR series, and I'll also put it in the description. I think though that unlike Stalin's forgivable ROC campaign, this could have worked well. Brezhnev, on the other hand, had the bomb which was planned awfully, was built by unprofessional young people and not by professional builders, and the gigantic waste of resources and money could have been prevented by making resources and money be used as little as possible and as efficiently as possible for the project. This is the sad reality of Soviet national projects, though I believe that they got less and bad. But I believe that they got less and less bad as time went on. The Con campaign wasn't anywhere near as bad as the ROC campaign, and the bomb wasn't as bad as the Corn campaign. Now, only because the leaders of the Soviet Union were bad at national projects isn't the reason for us Marxist-Leninists to be upset about it or straight up deny that they were awful at it. In fact, in a way this is good. This makes us better. It makes us stronger. It makes us smarter. By looking at the past mistakes, we can make the future better, and it's important for us as Marxist-Leninists to be self-critical. As Mao once said, we have the Marxist-Leninist weapon of criticism and self-criticism. We can get rid of a bad style and keep the good. This is the spirit. Anyway, now let's move on to the agricultural reforms of 1977 and 1981, more commonly known as the Brezhnev decrees of 1977 and 1981. To give some context, oil prices and prices in general of products, including food, were increasing. To combat this problem, Brezhnev increased private farming plots in 1977 by 0.5 hectares, and again increased private farming plots by 0.5 hectares in 1981, to quote an article. Meanwhile, state subsidies to the food and agricultural sectors did not hinder the work of bankrupt farms. The increase in product prices was offset by the rise in the cost of oil and other resources. By 1977, oil was worth 84% more than in the late 1960s. The cost of other resources also rose by the late 1970s. Brezhnev proposed to these concerns by issuing two decrees, one in 1977 and one in 1981, calling for an increase in the maximum size of private farming plots in the Soviet Union to half a hectare. Was this revisionist or a restoration of the collectivized farming or kulaks? No, in fact, private farming plots even existed under Stalin, even in 1937, 1 year after Stalin said that class antagonism and kulaks had been abolished, to quote a book. About 1/4 of Soviet agricultural production still comes from the private plots. These specialize in potatoes, contributing about 65% of total output, other vegetables about 40% of total, meat and milk 35% of total, and eggs 50% of total output. The dependency on private plots was even greater in the pre-war period. In 1937, when conditions in the specialized sector were very good indeed, private operated plots provided 52.1% of the total output of potatoes and vegetables and 56.6% of that of fruit. For animal products, the corresponding percentages were milk 71.4%, meat 70.9%, hides 70.4%, wool 43%. Okay, so each of the decrees increased the maximum size of private farming plots by 0.5 hectares, right? How big was the maximum size of private farming plots before 1977? Correct me if I'm wrong, but from my research I found out that the maximum size before 1977 of private farming plots was 0.5 hectares, and in special cases 1 hectare, to quote an article. Plots. It was a legally defined agricultural unit in the Soviet Union. It refers to a small plot of land, usually less than 0.5 hectares, adjacent to residences on collective farms. No maximum area was assigned to the plots at the time. It was all a work in progress. This was not worked out until the Kolkhoz model charter was issued, February 1935. It is at this time that the area was set at 1/4 to 1/2 hectare. This was usually smaller than the area allocated during Tsarist times. There were some up to 1 hectare, but only in special districts. The legislation established individual peasants as the holders, but in practice, plots were continued to be household tenure. Also, I explained how Stalin said that class antagonism, the bourgeoisie and kulaks had been abolished in 1936 in episode 1 of my Post-Stalin USSR series, and I talked about this many times already, so just rewatch the video if you want proof of Stalin saying that these things were abolished in 1936. Now, I'd also like to address a misconception. Many people say that the Brezhnev reintroduced private gardening plots. Is this true? No, they existed under Stalin already, to quote an article. The private garden plots were responsible for a stunning fraction of Soviet agricultural production. They provided Soviet collective workers with a substantial part of both their food and income. Despite the minuscule area of private garden plots, they accounted for over 20% of agricultural produce. 1938. Now we finally arrive at the 1979 Kosygin reforms. It's a bittersweet feeling to see the Brezhnev episode finally come to an end as we cover Brezhnev's last reform, or second last reform, considering that there was the Brezhnev decree of 1981 that we already talked about, and see the very long Post-Stalin USSR series soon come to an end with it. I must say, it has been a very long ride. It took me 800 hours to make all 4 parts of episode 6 alone, and around 1000 hours to make all the other Post-Stalin USSR videos. It's a big achievement to me, and I'm proud to see all this finally come to an end soon. And soon I'll start my Russia series as well. Well, enough with this useless blah blah blah. Let's talk about the 1979 Kosygin reforms. Before we start talking about the 1979 Kosygin reforms, I want to say that this reform is also often referred to as the July reform and was never fully implemented and was later, after Kosygin died, replaced by a Central Committee decree in 1981, about which we will talk a bit later, which essentially just implemented elements of the 1979 Kosygin reforms under the new chairman of the Council of Ministers of the Soviet Union, Nikolai Tikhanov. Anyway, let's finally talk about what the 1979 Kosygin reforms even were. What were they? To quote a book, the 1979 economic reform gave republic and local administrative bodies a broader influence on policymaking, and 2 years later the reform was consolidated by a decree from the Central Committee. This reform reminds me a bit of the Sovnarkhozy under Khrushchev. This reform is nothing like them, but it still reminds me of it. I will put my Khrushchev's economic reforms episode, which covers the Sovnarkhozy and the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, in the description, just like all other videos about the post-Stalin USSR's economy. Remember how I said in part 3 of episode 6 that the regional planning organs were more or less basically abolished, and how the state took control over everything because of the 1973 Kosygin reforms. Well, essentially, the 1979 Kosygin reforms wanted to continue the 1973 Kosygin reforms, while undoing the over-centralization that it caused and the damage that the 1973 Kosygin reforms did in regards to regional planning, by giving regional planning organs more power again, as much as they had before 1973 and under Stalin. Let's talk more in detail about the 1979 Kosygin reforms and how they gave more power to the regional planning organs by reading the book more. Thus, the 1981 decree clearly states that local administrative bodies ought to have greater influence, if mainly in an advisory and consultant capacity, while formal decisions concerning enterprises under the authority of all union ministries will be still taken at the union level. But the wording of the decree indicates that policymakers have realized the need for better coordination between union enterprises and those administered by local authorities. This issue, the relationship between union enterprises and enterprises under local Soviets, recurred in discussions during the Party Congress of 1981 and in the adoption of the 11th five-year plan. Dissertation pretty much says that the 1981 decree, which was basically the 1979 Kosygin reform, gave local administrative bodies, also known as local planning organs, more power, specifically in doing suggestions and arguing for what they think should be part or not part of a plan. They essentially planned the economy together with the state and Moscow, but couldn't do anything without state approval. It's like the Sovnarkhozy under Khrushchev, remember that? It also says that the reform tried to improve communication between enterprises and local planning organs. You know, they tried to make communication and the implementation of plans and all that faster and easier. And finally, this also says that the actual planning and all decisions are done by the state. Let's further prove that central planning continued to exist despite this reform. The reform provided for changes within the existing economic system with the intention of making the existing economic mechanisms more effective. Detailed central planning was to continue, and according to the reform would be even reinforced. Enterprises were given no new rights of the kind introduced in Hungary, for instance. The 1973 Kosygin reforms made production a little more inefficient, so like I said before, the 1979 Kosygin reforms tried to undo the destruction of the regional planning organs that the 1973 Kosygin reforms caused. Not did they just destroy regional planning organs, they also made production less efficient. So by returning regional planning organs to the way they were before 1973 and under Stalin, Brezhnev also tried to make production more efficient. Central planning was continued, exaggerated and reinforced. Reinforcing in English means to strengthen something. So this was also a very left-wing reform and a very centralizing one as well. We will talk about this more later. The reform also gave no new rights to enterprises and basically did no change to the economy at all, not even moderate changes. Let's further prove that central planning continued by further quoting the book. The party first secretary reports on actions taken by the Central Committee and the Supreme Party body since the previous Congress, after which the chairman of the Council of Ministers, or in the exceptional case the chairman of the Republic's Gosplan, reports on the guidelines for the five-year plan. After the discussions, resolutions are passed approving the annual reports in the five-year plan. Essentially, central planning continued, and the Central Committee and the state continued to make and draft plans, like the 11th five-year plan, for example. Alright, let's continue talking about how regional planning organs got more power. I will show you more on how central planning continued throughout the video. The July reform also calls for a strengthening of territorial planning, which indicates that the Union ministries and the USSR Gosplan will give greater heed to territorial considerations in compiling their plans. The Republic Councils of Ministers are to be drawn into planning activity, and they will also be kept informed on the details of the activities of all Union enterprises located in the territory of their respective republics. Further, Republic Councils of Ministers will be given the opportunity to present their views on plans for Union-managed enterprises, and the plan indicators for the latter will be integrated into Republic plans. For social and economic development, material resources and labor reserves will be put to better advantage. Gosplan SSSR and other central authorities will maintain territorial production balance sheets in collaboration with the Republic Council of Ministers, which will then serve as a statistical basis for the territorial distribution of output. Special programs for the problems of regional development will be compiled for the TPCS. Essentially, more power to regional planning organs, including Republic Councils of Ministers, was given by making them participate more in the making of plans, by making them make proposals and suggestions, like I mentioned before. And like I mentioned before as well, the 1979 Kosygin reforms sought to improve communication between enterprises and the regional planning organs. They also tried to do this by making regional planning organs be informed more on as many details as possible of how enterprises implement plans and stuff in general and do stuff in general. The reform also tried to improve rentability, or what is known in Russian as rentabiliность, meaning using resources as efficiently as possible, wasting as little resources as possible while creating products in the best quantity and best quality. Since we again don't have enough time to repeat the same thing all over again, I just advise you to watch episode 6 part 1 of my Post-Stalin series, where I cover rentability and all that in detail. Link will be in the description. The reform also sought to make the Gosplan central authorities, Council of Ministers, and Soviet republics responsible together for making statistics across the regions of the USSR. Statistics which cover input, output, how rentability, profit, resources, and tools of the republics and enterprises in the republics do. So how much profit, for example, an enterprise produces. I talked about profit, resources, and tools and all that stuff already in part 1 and part 2 of episode 6 of my Post-Stalin series. So check that out, buddy. What is a territorial production complex? To quote the Great Soviet Encyclopedia, it's a unit used in a particular type of territorial organization of the productive forces of Soviet social society. This type of organization corresponds most fully to the needs of the development of these productive forces within the context of the scientific and technological revolution. A territorial production complex forms part of an economic region or sub-region. It comprises all interrelated industrial and agricultural enterprises within a particular territory. The area encompassed need not correspond to an administrative territorial unit. Territorial production complexes figure prominently in the general system of the territorial division of labor. The economic unity of a territorial production complex is realized through the production links between enterprises, the utilization of natural and economic resources, and conditions common to the area, and the system governing the distribution of the population. In contrast to an isolated or random placement of enterprises, the organization seen in territorial production complexes makes possible significant economies because of the cooperation between enterprises, the possibility of combining enterprises, and the more rational use of natural and labor resources, secondary raw materials, and existing transportation networks. Economies are also realized through reduced construction costs for auxiliary and service enterprises, utility lines, and social and cultural facilities. Territorial production complexes are in most cases the result of a complicated interplay of both internal within the boundaries of the production complex in question, sources for development, local natural and labor resources, and accumulated assets in industry, agriculture and transport resources, and external territorial relations, links between regions regarding mobile factors of production. Territorial production complexes are not the same as economic regions. They do, however, serve as the material and technical base for the regions. Each of the levels of a territorial production complex is characterized by its own system of organizing territorial production links and by the extent to which the level is self-contained. An important parameter of a territorial production complex is the arrangement of the complex's basic elements, especially the industrial centers, clusters of agricultural enterprises, and structures of the industrial infrastructure linking the centers and clusters. Various industrial and agro-industrial combines comprising enterprises that interact to carry out the production process can be regarded as local functional elements of a territorial production complex. This is also the case with groups of processing enterprises that have a common source of raw materials or manpower, or that produce for a common user. Territorially, these local elements may be concentrated or dispersed. I'd also like to quote a book which explains what the TPCS are, though the book calls them TPKS, so keep that in mind, okay? The TPKS lacked effective managerial power. They merely served to provide a framework for the exchange of information between the agencies developing the complex and a point of reference for local politicians seeking to improve regional resource allocation. Officials called in vain for TPKS to be granted executive powers over the branch ministries. I haven't done much research about this, but I will try to explain this as best as I can. As far as I understand, it's basically a small economic region, which isn't really an economic region, which is subordinate to a larger economic region or Soviet Republic. For example, this Estonian Soviet Socialist Republic. To make things easier, let's call this a semi-economic region. It's independent in terms of uniting all the territorial production links like enterprises, resources, industrial centers, associations, infrastructure, industrial centers, materials, farms, and transportation networks on its own. Or, in other words, making them all be able to have contact with each other and be able to cooperate with each other. For example, the bomb was connected with resources like water under the territorial production complexes, and many enterprises were also in contact with each other under them. And also, the territorial production complexes had no actual power, so they couldn't participate in the making of plans or anything like that, and couldn't even implement them. Well, anyway, this was more to improve communication. Improving it was very important in this reform. What are regional development programs, by the way? It was part of the citation from before. So let's quote a book that explains what it is. One technique which attracted considerable academic attention was the drawing up of goal-related programs whereby planned balances were calculated separately for individual projects. Some 170 were prepared for the 1981 to 1985 period, mostly in the mining and consumer goods industries. However, these programs were largely paper exercises, and it is unclear whether they actually influenced resource allocation in the annual plans. Essentially, goal-related programs are just national projects, for example BUM, for which individual calculations for plans were made. Let's further talk about these programs. To quote a book again, the growing economic importance of Siberia and the Far East requires special action, for which special development programs are to be worked out. The July resolution charges the Gosplan USSR and the Council of Ministers of the RSFSR with the task of planning the regional distribution of output and working out a development program for these areas, with special attention focused on the production complexes. In developing these programs, it will be a matter of indifference under which ministry a particular enterprise belongs. Essentially, national projects were created like BUM to further develop places like Siberia and the Far East, or generally just improve the economy and the quality of transport, infrastructure, etc. These programs were created by the Gosplan and Soviet republics like the Estonian Soviet Socialist Republic together, and the regional distribution of output was planned by them together as well. These programs also tried to make it not important to which ministry and enterprise belongs to. It essentially again fixes the inefficiency that the 1973 Kosygin reforms created, which they also created by assigning enterprises to specific ministries and making it hard to coordinate them. Let's further talk about the regional distribution of output. More specific information on economic development in the republics is to be found in the 5-year plans adopted by the Supreme Soviets of the Union and of the republics in the fall of 1981. The data they contain help to fill in the picture of the kind of development desired by the political leadership and provide clues on whether the planned development will reduce regional differences. Plans for 3 of the most developed republics, the RSFSR, Estonia and Latvia, and for 2 of the less developed republics, Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, may be profitably compared in this regard. An analysis of these political decisions should help to determine the direction of regional development and the pattern of distribution of state allocations among the different regions. First, however, it will be useful to examine some of the decisions that should, in principle at least, give broader decision-making powers to regional and local administrative bodies in matters of planning. As mentioned before, the reform tried to give more posts to the local and regional planning organs and reduce regional differences, so there won't be much of a difference anymore between, let's say, Latvia and Turkmenistan. Latvia being a very wealthy and industrialized republic, whereas Turkmenistan is a very agricultural and underdeveloped one. Let's further talk about how the reform served to strengthen the regional planning organs, continued central planning, developed the regional development programs, and so on. The aim of the reform with regard to territorial planning seems to be to enhance the role of republic and local administrative authorities in it. Henceforth, and as has been mentioned, republic councils of ministers will be kept better informed on the activity of all union enterprises and will also be able to present their views in planning that activity, although they have not formally been given any additional decision-making powers in this respect. Republic authorities will also have a say in working out the special regional development programs. The same line of thinking on regional development that guided the July resolution is described in a decree issued jointly in 1981 by the Central Committee, the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet, and the Council of Ministers, entitled "A Further Strengthening of the Importance of the Soviets of People's Deputies in Building the Economy." In it, the focus is mainly on the local Soviets. For example, the Oblast and Krai Soviets, the Supreme Soviets of the ASSRs, and levels below them. The gist of the decree is that the coordinating controlling functions of the Soviets should be strengthened. According to the decree, the centrally compiled plans will be submitted to the appropriate local Soviets for their views on the utilization of land, environmental protection, utilization of labor, etc., and the Union and Republic administrative bodies to give due consideration to these views. The decree even moots the possibility of devolving authority over some enterprises from the Union to lower administrative levels. Essentially, the regional planning organs, such as local and republic planning organs, got more power. They also started to be informed more and better on the activity of enterprises and how they implemented plans. Their supervision of enterprises was also strengthened. Their control over them as well. They basically got their pre-1973 Kosygin reform powers back and were the ones now again that implemented plans, communicated with other enterprises and so on. Central planning also continued. The state created central plans and submitted them to local planning organs which implemented them, whereas the union bodies and republics looked at these plans and were encouraged to make suggestions. It's in a lot of ways like the Sovnarkhozy. Honestly, those are the Sovnarkhozy, but the 1979 version under a different name. I mean, the Sovnarkhozas essentially also couldn't do anything except for suggestions and were encouraged to do them, just like in this reform. This is a Sovnarkhoza copy pasta. I mean, there were even arguments to give authority from the state to regional planning organs, yet continue central planning and not allow the regions to do anything without state approval. It didn't really go back to pre-1973 Kosygin reform state era planning, but honestly, there is no difference between that and the Sovnarkhozy or the 1939 Kosygin reforms, which were basically Sovnarkhozy 2.0. Now let's talk about corruption and disputes. To quote the book again, Republic representatives often called attention to narrow sectoral attitudes and the difficulties in setting priorities correctly among the different regions. Territorial concerns will be given special consideration in calculating labor resources, and it is recommended that the special labor balance sheets be compiled with the collaboration of Republic and local administrative authorities to facilitate the territorial distribution of the workforce. Remember the corruption that the Sovnarkhozy caused under Khrushchev? Well, it was caused by the disputes between the economic regions of the USSR, which was the second worst thing about the Sovnarkhozy reform. The worst being that communication between the state/Moscow and the economic regions of the USSR was slow. Essentially, Brezhnev learned from the mistakes of the Sovnarkhoz and tried to return them but not repeat the two problems that they caused. Since, as we saw, this reform tries to improve communication between everything, between economic regions and the state, between enterprises and other enterprises, etc., and avoid corruption. I'm talking about the 1979 Kazygin reforms. In rare cases, communication was so bad during the Sovnarkhoz to a point where the economic regions didn't know what to do, so they had to ask the state again what they should do, and this made implementation of plans slower. And the 1979 Kazygin reforms tried to avoid such problems. The 1979 Kazygin reforms tried to avoid all this of Narkoz's problems by making it easier for regional planning organs to find out what they should do, what plans they should create, and so on. By improving communication, and the reform also tried to avoid disputes between regional planning organs by making the state, local, and republic planning organs work together and create statistics where it is said in which republic or district work is work. And the state, local, and republic planning organs would also work together in calculating how many resources which district and republic needs. Resources such as reserves and supplies like water, and decide whom these resources belong to. Let's continue reading about corruption and more. The July reform had several aims. Resources will be concentrated to cope better with certain major national problems, and narrow sectoral interests will no longer be allowed to decisively influence planning. Conditions were to be created to enable priorities to be correctly set among the various sectors and the various economic regions, especially with regard to the distribution of investment funds. Okay, anyway, the reform tried to further centralize resources, which is insane considering how centralized the economy under Khrushchev became after the abolition of small market leftovers from the Stalin era in 1956 and after the 1973 Kazygin reforms, which further centralized the economy. Which basically did the impossible. Now, corruption caused by the economic regions of the USSR would also no longer influence planning thanks to the 1979 Kazygin reforms, and the reform further emphasized how it's necessary to make it easier for regional planning organs to find out what they have to do, what plans they should create, and so on, especially in distribution of investment funds. What else did the 1979 Kazygin reforms do? To quote a book again. The July reform introduces certain modifications in the indicator system. For example, the weight indicators, which had long been particularly important in Soviet planning, will be eliminated. Secondly, planning will draw on the results of scientific research to a greater degree than heretofore. Special programs are to be developed in research and development, especially in technology, by Gosplan, the research institutes of the USSR Academy of Sciences, and other research centers. Some indicators were changed, specifically the ones which were sometimes causing inefficiency. For example, the weight indicators. Sometimes enterprises were producing just extremely heavy products in bad quality and managed to fulfill plans like that. To avoid this, the weight indicator was abolished, meaning that the weight of products didn't matter anymore. Planning also started to emphasize science more. Special programs were usually projects in research and development, and especially in technology, that were created by the Gosplan, the research institutes of the USSR Academy of Sciences, other research centers, but also by the republics of the USSR. Now let's talk about how the reform further exaggerated central planning. Though there is general agreement that on balance the measures had passed a re-centralizing effect, and there is certainly no evidence that those parts of the reforms on stable norms and counterplans which emphasized enterprise rights and autonomy were observed. The decrees nonetheless took a small further step towards defining the role of ministries as economic rather than state bodies by extending Khozrashet principles, though not practices. The beginning of this definition to be discussed discussed in greater detail in the last section of this chapter, had come with the conversion of Minpribor to a хозрасчетное министерство, cost-accountable ministry in 1970. In a far from radical way, the 1979 reform reaffirmed the separation of the ministry's economic functions from their state ones by announcing accounting procedures in which ministry contributions to the state budget from their profits were set at a fixed amount regardless of whether the branch profits plan was fulfilled. In summary, the various reforms from 1965 to 1979 were important in the way they established important principles, though they failed to alter the reality of ministry interests or powers. Instead, many of the measures resulted in a strengthening of that power. Хозрасчет was partially extended to ministries. If you want to know what хозрасчет is, watch episode 6 part 1 of my Post-Stalin USSR series. I explained it there. The state and economic functions of the ministries were separated during this reform, so they were split into ministries with economic functions and into ministries with state functions. As now the ministries had to give away a small amount of wealth that they owned to the state budget, which the state used for welfare programs, for public welfare programs like free healthcare, free education, free social security, free housing, and free food. The ministries were essentially taxed. It wasn't capitalism or the extraction of surplus value or exploitation. It's not like capitalists take money from the workers after they already earned it. So yeah, ministries were basically taxed by the state now. The reform also exaggerated central planning and centralized more by increasing the number of centrally planned indicators. What I'm showing you right now is on the same page of the book. Ministries also got more power now. A fact that I think is worth mentioning is that many officials wanted to abolish ministries like Khrushchev again and replace them with territorial production complexes. To quote a book, officials called in vain for TPKS to be granted executive powers over the branch ministries. Alright, so let's now talk about the 1981 decree and how it was different from the 1979 Kosygin reforms. Again, the importance of development in Siberia was particularly stressed. The Baikal-Amur Railway would open up new areas rich in raw materials, and the new TPCS in Siberia, Central Asia, and other regions will also grow rapidly during the upcoming plan period. Pursuant to Tikhanov's proposal, the Congress adopted the basic guidelines for the USSR's economic and social development in 1981 to 1985 and the period up to 1990. These guidelines concentrate in particular on the location of industry and on the growth of the 15 republics, with the following main points stressed. 1. Growth in the eastern regions will be accelerated, with particular stress on energy production in Siberia and Kazakhstan. 2. Better use will be made of the labor reserves of Central Asia, and the training of the labor force will be improved in this region. 3. Enterprises will be remodeled and technologically revamped in the European parts of the country. Existing resources will be put to better use. 4. The territorial production complexes will be further improved. 5. The role of local Soviets in planning will be strengthened, pursuant to the 1979 reform. Essentially, the 1981 decree wasn't that different from the 1979 Kosygin reforms. Actually, out of all honesty, they are the same thing. Also, at the end of part 3 of episode 6, there were some technical problems. So here's Lenin's code again on one-man management with a source. In conclusion, BOM was another failed national project in the USSR which had good intentions and could have worked well if the state would have planned better and would have used resources far more effectively, would have sent their actual professional builders and not young volunteers that go to university. The 1979 and 1981 Brezhnev decrees each extended private farming plots by 0.5 hectares, which already existed under Stalin. Brezhnev didn't establish private garden plots. The 1979 Kosygin reforms didn't reintroduce capitalism, and I said that they did not reintroduce capitalism, and they even exaggerated central planning, essentially returned the Sovnarkhozy in a more efficient manner. Under the damage that the 1979 Kosygin reforms caused, created more national projects to develop the USSR and more. Sources are in the pinned comment of the comment section. Like, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed. See ya, buddy.